Hello, everybody. I'm Elisa Donovan. I'm the Vice President and General Counsel of the Katy Prairie Conservancy. Our morning speakers, Ben Thomas and Sharon Buccino, did a great job teeing us up for this presentation, talking about carbon offsets and the intersection with the 30 by 30 initiative and how land trusts can participate in this emerging market. Our panelists are here to explain the developing options for participation in carbon offset protocols here in Texas. Our first speaker is going to be Kelly Watkinson, who's Land and Climate Program Manager of the Land Trust Alliance. They are supporting land trusts nationwide to become active participants in the market. Billy Gascioni, who's Associate Director of Conservation Strategy of Ducks Unlimited, has successfully registered and enrolled land conservation projects in North Dakota and Colorado to generate and sell carbon offset credits. Jim Blackburn, our local Houston-based environmental attorney, professor in practice and faculty scholar at Rice University and at the Baker Institute, is developing a new BCarbon program that rewards landowners for improved management practices that sequester carbon. And then Chad Ellis from our own Texas Agricultural Land Trust is CEO, and he has been engaged with the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium that is developing a market not only for carbon benefits, but also for other ecosystem services assets. I know we have a full panel and they have a lot to cover, so I'm going to turn it over to them quickly. Each speaker will make their presentation. We will hold questions and answers until the end of the session so that everyone has a chance to get through their presentation, and we can then hopefully have some good time for some discussion. There is a handout available, or 3 handouts. If you look in the chat, there will be a handout and some charts that you can refer to afterwards. And I think I need to re-engage the PowerPoint deck. So let's see if I can do that. All right, I think I'm ready to go. Yep, there we go. Okay, great. Well, with that, Kelly Watkinson, you are on. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Can everybody hear me? I'll just assume so. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I thought that it would be worth starting with a quick slide to frame up why land trusts and the Land Trust Alliance care about carbon, or should care about carbon. For one thing, climate change is here, and it's already impacting local communities and the work that land trusts do. Climate change impacts can be very different depending on your geography and your location. But as we all know, no region is immune to the threats. And increasingly, land trusts are looking to understand what actions they can take to help prepare for the changes and help address this challenge. So when talking about climate change, there are still a lot of unknowns, but one thing that is certain is that nature really must be part of the solution if we're going to achieve any of our state, national, or global level climate goals. So this chart here illustrates the potential impacts that nature or land-based solutions can have. So land protection, restoration, improved management can have in reaching our emissions goals. The research posits that nature can provide over 1/3 or 37% of the cost-effective climate mitigation needed between now and 2030 to stabilize warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. So in the US, this translates to about 21% of annual emissions. So alongside aggressive fossil fuel emission reductions, natural climate solutions really offers a powerful set of options that can both curb global warming and provide important co-benefits like clean water, greater flood protections, and habitat for diverse wildlife. Next slide, please. So land trusts are in the land management and land acquisition business, and we all know that that is not a cheap endeavor. So the Land Trust Alliance believes that carbon offsets are another tool in the conservation toolbox that can help generate revenue to support the stewardship of lands and to finance new conservation acquisitions. And so our carbon program aims to provide both conservation funding and to advance natural climate solutions. Next slide. This graphic, next slide. This graphic is designed to be a simplistic description of forestry and grassland carbon offset markets. Basically, landowners implement actions that protect carbon on the landscape. That carbon is quantified and registered as credits according to specific protocols developed by carbon registries. 1 credit equals 1 metric ton of carbon. Businesses buy, or individuals buy, credits from landowners to meet legal or voluntary emission reductions. And then each credit is given a serial number, and the registries are responsible for tracking credit ownership. There's 2 types of markets: the compliance market, like California's cap and trade, which is driven by legal requirements, and then the voluntary markets, which are mostly driven by social responsibility. Voluntary buyers include individuals, businesses, nonprofits, municipalities, sometimes utilities who have voluntary goals of reducing emissions. The cost to participate in voluntary markets are generally lower than compliance due to their less hoops to jump through, basically, but the risks can be higher due to price uncertainty and a need to find voluntary buyers. Next slide. There are a number of barriers to entry for land trusts, or anyone really, when thinking about carbon markets. And as the Alliance put together our carbon program, we tried to keep these in mind and tried to help solve for some of these barriers. The first being that protocols, carbon markets, and just the way that credit sales are structured can be really complicated and overwhelming for land trusts to figure it all out. Cost to develop projects can be significant, more so for forestry than grasslands, but there's still a cost barrier there. There's uncertainty in pricing for credits, as I mentioned, especially within the voluntary market, where the price per credit can vary widely, even for the same protocols and the same types of projects. Prices are not public on the voluntary market, and they're often protected by confidentiality agreements. And last but not least, not everyone is a fan of carbon markets as a tool to address climate change. So land trusts really need to think through any reputational risks that could arise, both from the perspective of additionality. Is the project you're doing creating additional carbon sequestration that wouldn't already happen? And then also with who you're selling your credits to, or who you would be willing to sell your credits to. There could be some reputational risks there. So the purpose of the Alliance's carbon offset program is to demonstrate how land trusts can access voluntary carbon markets via a partnership between the Land Trust Alliance and Finite Carbon for Forestry and the Climate Trust for Grasslands. For forestry, we are looking to work with accredited land trusts that have forested fee lands that do not perform on their own for a carbon project, and combining holding and looking to combine their holdings with other land trusts to develop a project that would then be economically feasible. For grasslands, we're looking to facilitate the permanent protection of grasslands through an easement funding model based on anticipated future carbon revenues. So providing an upfront payment to help with the acquisition that can then be paid back over time with carbon revenues. And this is with in partnership with the Climate Trust. And the handouts that Elise mentioned, there are a lot of details about the program. I don't have time to go into a ton of details here. There's also a link to an application of interest form, and this doesn't commit you to doing a project in any way. It's basically just a way for the Alliance to let you know, to let us know that you want to have an initial conversation and explore this idea. Next slide. I've talked about protocols a lot, and I'm sure you'll hear it from the other presenters, so I thought I'd just include a definition here. Protocols are the rules that govern eligibility, carbon calculations, monitoring, and reporting requirements for a specific project type. The Alliance's carbon program for forestry, we are working through the American Carbon Registry and their improved forest management protocol. For our grassland project, we're working with the Climate Action Reserve through the Avoided Grassland Conversion Protocol. Next slide. Other than the programs that my fellow presenters that you'll hear from in just a few minutes will cover, city forest credits are the only other Texas opportunity I know about at this time. This is a new registry specifically created to transact urban forestry credits. It's not part of or associated at all with the Climate Action Reserve or the American Carbon Registry. They work with projects in urban areas defined by the census. They're fairly new. They transact in smaller quantities due to the nature of urban projects. And to my knowledge, only a small number of credits have been sold to date. The land trusts that are listed here are currently working with city forest credits, though I've not spoken to them directly about their experiences. And there are a few tree planting projects that are happening here or there in Texas, one in Houston and one in Austin, if you want to check those out. Next slide. And you can just keep clicking. This has some animation on it. And one more click. Perfect. So with all of the different carbon related offerings being pitched, it's more important than ever to be an informed consumer. There are a few basic questions that landowners or land trusts should be able to answer when considering a project as they're doing their due diligence. It's important to know what the product is that you're going to generate. Is it an offset? Is it a cost share payment? Is it a lease of some sort? There's a lot of different products out there. What are the commitments and how long are you committing? Is it 20 years, 40 years, 50 years, 100 years? Different protocols have different commitments. And what's the deal structure for the sale of the credits? Do you have a guaranteed buyer in place at a guaranteed price? Are there option payments in place at a specific price for a certain amount of credits? Or is it full consignment? After you generate the credit, you look for a buyer and you see what you can get in terms of cost. And then is the program fully baked, or are you being asked to commit to something that is still in development or is brand new? Next slide. So with all of that, the Alliance knows from our research that carbon markets and carbon offsets can be complicated. So to help land trusts understand the landscape better, we have two recently developed documents to share with you. The first is a general overview of carbon markets. And then the second is a bit more technical, and it really digs into the intersection between conservation easements and carbon offset projects. It also includes some language, some easement language for conveying and confirming carbon ownership, which is an important aspect to think about. So the handout that I previously mentioned has some links in it that will point you to both of those documents as well. And I think that was my 10 minutes. So I'm going to hand things back over to Elise.
Thank you for that, Kelly. That's great that the Land Trust Alliance is supporting land trusts as we navigate, because there is quite a bit to learn. And with that, I think we're going to move to Billy Gascioni from Ducks Unlimited. Billy?
Thanks, Alyssa. Wonderful. All right. As Alyssa mentioned, my name is Billy Gascoigne. I'm the Associate Director of Conservation Strategy for Ducks Unlimited. And I was asked to talk about the nuts and bolts of generating and selling grassland carbon offsets from our own personal experience, being in this space for over a decade now and managing the largest avoided grassland conversion of grassland portfolio in the world, actually. And then I'll wrap up with some what I call general ramblings and some talking points that I think are important for land trusts considering, maybe venturing into this space and some of the realities that I have come to personally. So, and I only have 11 minutes to teach you everything about carbon offsets and what to avoid. So I'll jump right into it. And I apologize if I run through it too quickly here, but feel free to follow up either at the end of these presentations or offline with me personally. I'm happy to chat about this stuff. Next slide. So I put this picture up here and posited this question first and foremost because I see some puzzled faces when they hear about Ducks Unlimited's experience in this space, recognizing us predominantly as a wetland conservation organization. And I just like to crosswalk that and the fact that waterfowl are upland nesters, often finding suitable grassland sites a mile away from the nearest wetland. So Ducks Unlimited in our 84-year history has spent a lot of time, effort, and and money restoring, enhancing, and protecting grassland landscapes, particularly up in the northern Great Plains and into the prairies of Canada. Next slide. And Alyssa, there's a series of some photos here that you can just click through. There's about 5 of them. But I wanted to give some perspective on the resource issue at hand here, the fact that these grasslands remain under extreme threat, and kind of what it looks like from a duck's perspective and why we care so much about various mechanisms in which we can incentivize grassland preservation. You can see here these glaciated landscapes up in the prairies are ideal breeding grounds for nesting waterfowl, and we've seen huge conversion into row crop agriculture predominantly at a rate and an extent that exceeds the deforestation you hear often about in the Amazon rainforest. So big resource concerns across a large scale, and at the end of it, there's just not that much habitat value remaining there on the landscape. And we started to really investigate this stuff at the height of the commodity markets in the mid-2000s, when we tried to figure out if there's any way we can add additional financial incentives for landowners to protect grasslands and keep them from being converted. Next slide. And so to fast forward here to today, I manage the Grassland Carbon portfolio for Ducks Unlimited, and the portfolio we have in North Dakota, which is our Prairie Pothole program, spans 28,000 acres. It's made up of over 50 landowners in 74 different participant fields. That took about 2 to 4 years to really pull that together, and significant time, effort, and money to do so. I added a project here in southeastern Colorado called the May Ranch Project, which I'll talk a little bit more in a few slides, that had 13,500 eligible acres under contiguous ownership. We've issued and actually transacted, so we sold over 100,000 offsets to date. We have another 100,000 avoided grassland conversion credits in verification as we speak. That represents a significant proportion of the overall marketplace. And to do so, we had to co-author and sat on a number of technical working groups with both the American Carbon Registry and the Climate Action Reserve to develop their protocols in the multiple versions that have come out since inception. So it's been a learning experience, but once you get into it, you kind of have to, you get pulled into the protocols themselves in addition to the projects. But next slide. And so how does it work? And this has evolved since we got into the space, and it's actively evolving, I think, getting better, and folks looking for improvement, folks like Jim and his team, looking to see how they can make this more efficient. But here are those key steps, and Kelly touched on a lot of them. It starts with the protocols themselves, those methodologies that provide the rule books and the guiding document for participating landowners and project developers to follow. And those are truly rooted in science. And what I like to point out, it also needs to be rooted in feasibility. I think too often it was just rooted in science. There's a number of protocols produced kind of in the early years that have sat on shelves and never generated a single credit to date. And I don't think that's what any of us want to see. So we have some protocols in the grassland space that have gone through multiple versions now. They have improved. Those protocols are housed by these overarching registration bodies like Climate Action Reserve and the American Carbon Registry. Once you have those protocols in place, you're free to assess them and see how they could work in a business planning framework for you as land trust, for the landowners that you represent. And then you're free to kind of follow through those protocols and register projects. Once you feel you've done so and that physical time has passed, you go through third-party validation and verification of the project. Those bodies produce a report that goes back to the registries. They review everybody's work and make sure the I's are dotted, T's are crossed, et cetera. And once all that has been done and verified, they will ultimately, hopefully, issue a certification and the issuance of the credits themselves into your account. And I think there is a transition here, at least if you don't mind clicking again. And once they're in your accounts, you're free to go sell them. And I also point here that you are signing up for long-term monitoring and reporting obligations. And when those credits are in your account and you're free to sell them, we often talk about these as markets. And as an economist in a former life, I point out there really aren't markets in the true sense. They're one-off transactions, at least in our experience and what I see is to be the case in the foreseeable future. And so we're often engaging with brokers that then resell them. But ultimately, we are marketing our project in and of itself. And I'm trying to point out how there's so much integrity to it and all these ancillary benefits, and basically sell it off as a one-off transaction. And so it's quite unique, and just recognize that there is a significant amount of effort to get them from your account ultimately to an end buyer and be able to pull that revenue in and disperse it back on down to those that are part of the project. Next slide. And here's a schematic. I was asked to maybe give a highlight of the May Ranch project and how it kind of came together, just to give you an insight of all the pieces to that puzzle. And I'm not sure this is as clear as I desired it to be, but it gets kind of messy here. And hopefully you can ascertain that it starts with the landowners. We were the project developer of the carbon project itself. These carbon protocols require long-term protection agreements, and to date, that's essentially a perpetual easement. So we had partners that carried out the easement side of that project with the Conservation Fund, and the Nature Conservancy helped out a little bit there. And we needed to pull in somebody to hold the easement, to monitor, and both for the easement itself and for some of the carbon requirements. So we had Colorado Cattlemen's Ag Land Trust partner on that for us, and we set up an endowment with them to make sure their financial expenses were covered. I was asked to de-risk the project as much as possible by my directors, because 3 years ago the market was completely different. There was huge uncertainty. Roughly 40% of all credits that were generated were going unsold. And so I brought in an impact investor that basically acted as an insurer. And then we worked with the registry, I worked with the brokerages, and ultimately it goes down to the end buyer. But we, as a project developer with the May Ranch here, we take on all the long-term liability. We are the account holder with the registry, which has annual fees and attestation forms that we have to fill out. We cover all the modeling, GIS, report writing. We oversee all the verification whenever we choose to do so, landowner relationships, financial accounting, payments, marketing, and ultimately the sales and transactions that have to occur. So hopefully that helps kind of just frame how that project came together and who was all involved. Next slide. And to close here on some observations and personal conclusions, I guess, the market demand and therefore the prices we're seeing in the marketplace today are significantly higher and more robust than they were just 2 or 3 years ago, which is great. And I don't see that changing. We sold, just for perspective, we sold the first ever Grassland carbon credits in the world to Chevrolet in 2014. We weren't able to sell a single credit for 3 years thereafter. I think, again, with all these climate commitments from corporations in the private space, I think we're beyond that, and the market is a whole lot more stable, even in this voluntary space. So that's great for folks that have limited resources and can't take on huge risk when engaging in these efforts. With that, the scrutiny is also increasing, particularly around avoided conversion projects where additionality is often questioned. And I think that's a good thing. We have to have integrity to these projects for them to maintain their viability long term and truly be offsets for corporations to use. And so there's, just a series of Bloomberg articles here that called out the additionality on some avoided conversion projects, and just recognizing, Kelly touched on this, there is ways in which you're setting yourself up for some potential reputational risk, even if you followed every step of the protocol itself. You just need to kind of look at the project and make sure there is integrity in and of itself. There are no grassland sequestration projects to speak of to date. There is a grassland sequestration protocol that I'm aware of out there, but I don't think it has ever generated a single credit. So I often get asked about the potential to generate carbon credits from restoring marginal cropland, and that has still really hasn't proved to be the case. So it's something we're constantly assessing, but thus far there's nothing really there for us to draw from. The protocols themselves are getting a lot more efficient. There's lower transaction costs, and these are improving every version that seems to come out. So that's a great thing. Access to buyers is improving as well. At the end of the day, scale still is very important. You're likely looking at, less than 1 ton an acre per year on these grassland projects. And so you need to be able to still get to scale to cover costs and verification, marketing, buyer access, and then ultimately, our goal to put dollars in the pockets of working landowners. You need to manage long-term risk and obligations. I think it was 12 months after the May Ranch project was registered and we got credits over the line, we had a big scare with eminent domain and a utility line that was, threatening to come through the middle of that project. So things do happen even with easements on these parcels, and I'm sure most of the listeners are aware of that. There's the interesting catch-22 with improved farming practices and the advancement of soil health that I was somewhat naive to when this was all getting going. Recall that for avoided conversion projects, we are getting offsets based on the delta of it staying in grass versus going into a cropping system. And that cropping system, at least in the Northern Great Plains, has seen a lot of advances in soil health practices with no-till cover cropping. And so that delta has shrunk as we model that baseline scenario versus our project scenario. And I've lost about 30% of the credits just because of the improvement in farming practice, which as a conservationist, it's great to see that. You're never gonna see us complain about it, but it's just something from a business planning perspective we were unaware of, and for folks to keep in mind. And then lastly here, this is a point that has been brought up to me, and I've investigated it extensively of late, is the potential to generate carbon offsets from existing easements that don't have a sodbuster clause. And there's a lot there that I uncovered, but ultimately I think there's a lot of eligibility concerns that remain because of the inherent conservation values that are front and center in paragraph 1 of all those easements. And the fact that the easement holding land trust would probably have to sign an affidavit saying, we agree that plowing up all this native historic prairie does not impact the conservation values. And I just don't think that holds water, even though there might be some retained rights by the landowner themselves. So a lot there to uncover, but I know that is a point of conversation, folks. And with that, Alyssa, I'll turn it back to you and look forward to any questions that may come in.
Thank you so much, Billy. That was great. And there is a lot to unpack in how to do one of these projects. Great. We're going to turn to Professor Blackburn.
Good. Next slide, please. I want to talk about BCarbon, which is a new system that we have developed at the Baker Institute at Rice. We have formed a new registry called BCarbon, which is a nonprofit in Houston, and it's all kind of overseen by a stakeholder group that I will talk about. But I want to start by saying we are about creating a market. And I'm an environmental lawyer, and for 40, 50 years, environmental law has been all about regulation. And basically, it's been about putting boundaries on existing markets. But we're talking about here about creating a market. And I just want to emphasize, creating a market is a very different thing than regulating an existing market. And I think we have a tendency, I think, to rely too much on regulation. And frankly, I'm not sure we know how to create a market. So I think as an environmental strategy, creating a market is a really new and unique feature that I'm not sure that we've really thought through as much as we should. So I want to start by saying we want to create a market because we want to get to scale. At BCarbon, our personal goal is to get to 25 million tons of credits in the first 5 years. We will be issuing our first credits starting in June, July of this year. We already have 100,000 credits lined up to be issued, and are in the process of kind of getting 200,000 for our first year. So we're happy to get started, and we also have integrated diversity and equity inclusion into our carbon market, which I think is a first as well. Next slide, please. Just want to emphasize, I think industry has a lot of trouble. A lot of emitters have trouble thinking about carbon dioxide kind of removal and storage by nature. Most of them feel most comfortable thinking about technology. And I think if any of us had patented photosynthesis, it would almost be an easier sell than the fact that it's free and available. And so I just think there's some basic, very kind of interesting differences. A lot of people just have trouble kind of understanding how nature fits into this whole process. And I think the answer is it has a huge role if we can just liberate it. Next slide, please. And scale is really the most important thing I want to say. I think market has the potential to unleash scale, and I'm talking about hundreds of millions and potentially billions of tons of carbon dioxide removal and storage. What I have drawn a red circle around is a map that shows in yellow the grasslands or kind of rangelands of the country, and in brown the farmlands of the country. But this is also a sweet spot where kind of good soils and good rainfall come together. With various types of grazing techniques, I think it is potential to get possibly a bit more than the ton an acre that Billy was talking about. I think, certainly less than a ton an acre for natural grasslands is probably a pretty good number. But we have hundreds of millions of acres. We have 200 million that are being used to produce food for livestock. To convert that back to grasslands would be a fabulous result, I think. There are all sorts of potential here, but I think we have to be creative to liberate that potential. Next slide. The work that we're involved in at Baker Institute started on the Texas coast looking for solutions for hurricane surge buffering. We wanted to set aside 6 million acres along the coast that was 20 feet or lower. And we realized very quickly we're going to have to work with private landowners. And we got to looking at the existing systems that were out there and realized they were really set up between countries. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But the most important thing is that in the United States, we're going to have to deal with a lot of private landowners. And those of you that are in the trust business know this. We've worked with landowners. But on the Texas coast, we went out and talked with a lot of landowners. We interviewed a lot of the landowners to see what it would take to get them involved in a voluntary market. And we decided that we're going to have to talk property rights. We're going to have to be talking the language that the landowners knew and understood. So our approach began to depart quite a lot from the kind of existing protocols because we were really working from a landowner-friendly standpoint. So I just want to throw that out that, this is really coming from kind of the requirements of working in Texas. We're dealing with strong property rights, and we found, frankly, a lot of support for this through a lot of the different stakeholders that we've got involved. Next slide. We formed a stakeholder group that became really the heart and soul of this effort that we're undertaking. All that I'll be talking about that follows is going to be directly related to kind of what comes out of the stakeholder group. We have about 70 institutional members. The breakdown of that is over on the side. These are a few of the representative members. We have about 170 participants on the email list. And the point being that this is open to anyone who's interested. If you're interested, you can contact me at blackburr, no N, at rice.edu. You're welcome to join. We welcome people. This is not a pay-to-play system. This is a system that's very democratic in its origins, and we take input from all. Next slide. Next slide, Elisa. Thank you. What we found was that the current system is too inhibitory. The current system, which is based off the Kyoto Clean Development Mechanism for the most part, is where mostly all of the current standards are derived. And we believe that they are too inhibiting. We don't think you can regulate your way to a market. And so we think we have to be much more landowner friendly. We've got to work with the market to basically nurture and create it. Next slide. This is our image in a way, and this is a circular, the virtuous cycle is what our economist calls it. But essentially, we're talking about planting seeds of essentially grasslands, if you will. And the more that our market grows, the more that we will encourage people to become involved in it. It's really about getting this whole process underway in a large scale version. We know that carbon will be sequestered by grasslands. We know that it can happen. We've got to liberate that potential. Next slide. What we have come up with, we do have protocols. We do have our standards. Basically, we require that there is testing prior to initiation of the award of credits. Testing is a precondition. You have to test. We will be verifying with subsequent testing. We will allow interim transactions after the initial testing has been undertaken. So testing is required. This is old scale technology. All of our participants trust going out, taking borings, taking to the laboratory, and running your measurements. It is a slow process. It's an expensive process. We've got a whole research arm at Rice University that's working to try to develop remote sensing concepts, that are trying to develop less invasive ways of testing, much quicker, less expensive ways. But for right now, we're starting with basically that Giddings probe or something similar, taking samples to the lab. We require commitment for no plowing or subsurface destruction. We are also working with no-till agriculture, particularly in Great Britain. We've got I think a pilot project that we're developing over in Yorkshire. But I think the point being that we don't want to be digging up the carbon that we put there. You've got to keep that carbon in situ. We require 10 years of commitment for each transaction. And over a 5-year project, that's a minimum 15-year commitment to begin with, but each year of sale is a new 10-year commitment. So it's what we call a rolling 10-year commitment. We think that as long as the market is vibrant, there is going to be an incredible amount of time that these lands will be basically tied up in this market, and we think it's got an incredible potential for large-scale sequestration and change. Next slide, please. We think that there are massive co-benefits associated with these grasslands restoration projects and grassland carbon sequestration. Not only do you get carbon resilience, you also get water resilience from both flood control and water supply standpoint. We think, certainly rural economic resilience, ecological resilience, all of those are co-benefits. And we're got specific activities that we're pursuing with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion, to identify Native American, to identify African American, Hispanic landowners, seek out their participation in the BCarbon process, and to move forward with the essentially the inclusion of everybody in this process. Last slide, please. And I just want to end by saying there are 2 other systems that are up in the Texas coast. We have a Texas Coastal Exchange, and then we're in the process of developing a Texas Hill Country Exchange. These are more local, more regional kind of efforts that are really more about ecological restoration, but we are using carbon payments to the landowners as a part of these systems. And there's a website for Texas Coastal Exchange. Hill Country Exchange is under development. And with that, Lisa, our next presenter.
Thank you so much, Professor. Always a professor. He was my environmental law professor.
Always a professor.
Thank you. And with that, Chad, it's your turn.
Thank you, Elisa. You go ahead and advance to the next slide. And I look forward to really, continuing the rambling, as Billy calls it, of my good friend Billy and Jim and Kelly around, the carbon markets and market opportunities. And really want to share a little bit more about the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium. It was built for producers, backed by science. So it's a nonprofit that works to compensate farmers and ranchers who improve the environment through their agricultural practices and management. The same things that we heard from Billy and Jim have shared. Our market program is really designed to reduce our GHGs, improve water qualities, and increase other ecosystem service benefits for all of society. Next slide, please. So really, this marketplace kind of really started in 2016. At that time, I was working for the Noble Research Institute, there in Ardmore, Oklahoma, and was receiving multiple calls. And Bill Buckner, who was the CEO at that time, both of us were receiving, and were asked of, could we convene a meeting and bring folks and look at the carbon markets, right? What I call the good, the bad, and the ugly, and start having that conversation. And so we brought in 50 folks that looked at the issue of carbon markets through multiple different lenses, right? We had farmers and ranchers, we had researchers, we had government agencies, we had the registries, we had potential buyers, we had NGO representation, like Billy. Billy was there at those first meetings in 2017 and on. And we kept having these discussions and really came to how can we get through these barriers, right? And the barriers being additionality and permanence. And what Billy really discussed is the feasibility, right, of making sure that we're increasing the cash flow from the transactions back to the producer and making these a true viable marketplace. And so in 2019, after multiple conversations with around 250 people involved, we really said, hey, we need to move forward with this. This is something real. And in 2019, we were formed ESMC. It's a subsidiary under the Soil Health Institute currently, and our mission is really to advance these ecosystem service markets that incentivize farmers and ranchers to improve the soil health and the systems that benefit society. Next slide, Elisa. So we are a nonprofit, member-based organization. We have over 60 members, and as we can see here on the slide, our members are farmers and ranchers, they're ag commodity organizations, food and beverage companies, agribusinesses, nonprofits, environmental and conservation organizations across the agricultural supply chain and the value chain. I do want to highlight a couple of our members are like us from a land trust perspective of our partners of Rangeland Trust, as well as American Farmland Trust are members. Next slide. One of our first works that came about was when we talk about carbon, it's like, how big is the pie, right? How big is that pie? And so we went and did an RFP on a economic assessment and analysis of how big that pie was. And this was done in 2018. It's 3 years old. It's old data. We all kind of know that this is changing. One of the things of all of our communication and conversations that we had over the years was that more likely that carbon itself in the marketplace was not enough, right, to make change and to help from the producers. So we looked at really developing a marketplace that looked at stacking these ecosystem services. So we had to start somewhere, and so our first protocol developments were around carbon, water quality, and water quantity. So our first work was on this RFP. As we can see from the marketplace, we looked at in 2018, there was a little over $5 billion worth in the marketplace around carbon, and then another additional about $8 billion in the water quality area, so around $14 billion. So it was enough that there was enough money that for us to kind of start moving forward in this stack service approach. Next slide. So what we look at is really looking at from a scope 1 and a scope 3 aspect. So ESMC really generates multiple stacked assets for use in one or two of the existing ecosystem service markets. What we've referred to the scope 1 or the voluntary carbon offset markets, some of these markets that Billy was talking about. And then we have the scope 3 or the corporate supply chain reporting market. These concepts of different scopes is really based on our greenhouse gas protocol developed by the World Resource Institute. Buyers generally have stated commitments to reduce both their scope 1 and scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions and can buy the offsets to account for their scope 1 emission reductions. And ESMC's program really can generate our scope 1 offsets for purchase and can also support the corporate interventions in their supply chain to help generate these credible claims and about to reduce the greenhouse gases or increase the soil carbon stored in the soils by the farmers. The scope 3 greenhouse gas emission reductions are to really increase the soil sequestration. On the other hand, come from sources not owned or directly controlled by the company, but related to their activities. The scope 3 must reduce a company's footprint associated with the products, example of the corn or beef that they may be purchased by the company, and they must come from the supply shed that their product was purchased from. The next slide, please. So what we're looking at is a modular tiered protocol, really stacked multiple credits of water use conservation credits, improved water quality credits, soil carbon, reduced GHG credits, and then we're working on and planning or working on right now biodiversity credits. So it's looking at stacking these services. ESMC really quantifies, verifies, and they certifies these stacks credits. Our gold standard and sustained cert are our global certification bodies that we're using for this certification aspect. And then ESMC pays the farmers. Next slide, please. So when we look at all the protocols in this tiered modular approach, we can kind of see here on this screen, we have multiple assets from a scope 1 and a scope 3 perspective. So ESMC's market launches in 2022. So here in the next year, so producers will be able to enroll into either a scope 1 or scope 3 project, and payments will depend on the specific assets being sold to either the scope 1 or 3 markets. And the market will dictate the value of each of the producer's ecosystem services on this. So the next slide. And it really kind of starts out with when we started our work was looking at piloting. So we took the approach instead of a lot of smart people sitting in a room developing protocols, sending those out for scientific review, and then publishing those protocols. And Billy kind of alluded to this, is that what happens is you have a lot of protocols that are really well written. They're sitting on shelves not being used for multiple reasons. And sometimes they're being that way because they just don't work for the farmer and rancher. And Jim understands this, and BCarbon is trying to fight this issue as well. So it's great to see all the work Jim is doing. So we have around 15 pilots across the country. So what we do is we develop those protocols, pilot those protocols, and then adapt those protocols for each region, right? We know each region has different soils, climate, and ag systems. And so we're able to adapt the protocol for the region and the producers and the need of that area. I led the first pilot in Texas and Oklahoma, around 50,000 acres with about 12 different ranchers, and moving forward with that. Next slide, please. So really our program is really about a public-private partnership operating in this pre-competitive space, right? We do have a science arm as same as Jim, in that we have a $20 million research project with the Foundation for Food Ag Research to help kind of bring this science and research to help the development of these protocols as we move forward. But one of the key things I think is that we're standard-based, we're science-based, we're certified-based, and we're looking at really developing this stacked approach, and that will help most producers in better conservation on the ground. One of the key components too is that producers own their data. The credits are only shared upon agreement with that. So I think that's another key aspect. We're definitely through that producer lens, and we have a robust data privacy and security policy and procedures. The last slide, please, Alyssa. And so from us, I put my hat on as a Texas Ag Land Trust, why is these things important? All of this work of Jim and what Billy and Kelly have talked about and ESMC and future other marketplaces is that we need to find more tools in the toolbox that we can help our legacies and heritage pass down to that next generation. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Alyssa, for questions.
Thank you. And I will remind everyone that there are handouts available. I know we have had a lot of information presented, and there's at least, a couple charts to try to put everything in a box and how do these work together, who's actually the registry, what's the protocol, where might this be applicable for what type of land or practice. And you can see I think there's a whole page of forest, and then there's a couple of pages of potential participation in Texas. And I think, especially the work of Chad and Billy and Jim, shows us that there's actual viable projects to be had, if not already, hopefully in the next, year or two, to generate some funds. We have received a few questions in the chat, and I encourage everyone, if you have more, to please go ahead and put them in there, because we do have about 10 minutes for questions and answers. I think the first question I'm going to direct towards Kelly, which was, have there been any successful public examples of carbon credit deals for either on city or public parkland?
Yeah, thanks, Elisa. I would the only ones that I know of are through the City Forest Credits program, and they're their own nonprofit, they're their own registry, and they focus exclusively on urban credits. And so they have two programs. One is a reforestation program, and there are projects in Austin and Houston that are happening with those projects. The one in Austin is led by Tree Folks, and it's Eastern Travis County. And then there's one in Houston, the TC Jester Riparian Reforestation Project. So you could look into those. And then there's also sort of these preservation protocols, which would be more of just preserving the existing trees in a park. And that's what some of the land trust projects that I were on the slide I had were doing. They were considered preservation. So that's my only lead.
Fantastic. And there's another question about desert carbon markets. I hadn't ever heard of a desert carbon market, and I'm not sure if anyone on our panel has.
Yeah, I'll respond very quickly. In that part of the work we're doing at BCarbon is going to be a pilot study out in the Permian Basin, Western Texas, out into New Mexico. Some of that will be much more arid land, and we're just going to see what the potential is out there. Also looking at regen grazing. So yeah, I think there will be some data. I can't say that we have a lot of data yet, and those are not the prime prospect lands, but there may be some potential there.
Fantastic.
I would add one thing. I'll just say, if you were to follow the links to our Grassland pilot, there is an Excel spreadsheet which lists different counties in different states where the soils through the Climate Action Reserve program are deemed ineligible. A lot of those are desert projects, and that's something that's determined by the registries, what is eligible and what's not eligible. But there is a chart that you can get to through our website that tells you what those counties and states are.
Great, thank you, Kelly. Billy, Chad, I'm going to direct this question to you because it relates to the ESMC, which is, how would a conservation organization begin to gain access to bring projects or landowners to participate in this program? Where do we start?
Yeah, so a great question. So where we're at right now is just in that pilot stage with around 15 pilots. We're working towards actually have developed modules that are educational modules that would help the land trust or other project managers kind of know the ins and outs and how the marketplace will work. And so we should have those out and released, here, I would say the next 4 or 5 months. So that would be a start. And then Again, I'm always happy to have one-offs, and please contact me and we can further and see where we can help and where potential pilots and projects can move forward with.
Great. And I have a question for Billy, which is, okay, how much money are we talking? It sounds like you've done some pretty large deals. So is there a minimum size that is required? If the market's going up, can we afford to do smaller deals? Can you just talk a little bit about, without pinning down exact sort of ranges of possible revenue?
Sure. And I'll speak in the context of existing protocols purely that are focusing on avoided conversion of avoided grassland conversion. And you're right. I mean, everything's changing. The main factors there are the price per ton and the cost to bring those credits to market. And then ultimately, what you can hand down to the landowner and cover your own costs at the same time. If you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I would say that the minimum acreage requirement would probably be upwards of 8,000 acres or more, probably with current price points more around 5,000. Those are my own personal opinions and just how I manage risk. And we're looking at, with Climate Action Reserve, 100 years post last credit issuance. So if you get credits for 30 years, you're looking at a 130-year commitment. That's a long, long time. And so there's other costs that go into bringing those credits to market. And so I don't know how much that translates down to the actual landowner. That's hard for me to comment on that at this point, but it's in the range that we've been seeing on the marketplace now, probably in around under $10 an acre, certainly under that for us, just with when we got engaged and how we started these projects and where the markets were.
And that would be $10 an acre one time over several years. So
that's the other thing. We remember back in 2008 and 9 when we started this stuff, the rules were completely unknown. The landowners in North Dakota didn't really want to enter into a revenue sharing agreement by which we shared risk and uncertainty. And to really get them comfortable with the concept of carbon payments, they required upfront payments, or at least heavy forward weighted payments. And so we, DEU, had to take on a lot of that financial risk upfront and structure those contracts to be more revenue focused on those early years, to where then we took on those risks thereafter. Moving forward on other deals, I think the market's in place now where we can share that risk. There's, those price points are a lot more transparent. And for the May Ranch, we entered into a revenue sharing agreement. So we have, we have the ability to share revenue that comes in the door as long as we generate credits out of that project. So every deal is a little different. I like to put that out there. That everybody thinks it's, well, how much per acre and how do we structure the stuff? You really have to think about what that land looks like, the size, all the components of the project itself, and look at it at a project level and see if you can't make it work for your organization and for those working landowner families.
Lisa, if I could jump in just for a second, we're seeing prices in the $17 to $20 per ton range that are beginning to emerge. And I mean, the transactions that are being brought to BCarbon are in that range. I would also say that actually the email address you've got for me up here, there's no J in mine. So if someone wants to get a hold of me, and they're welcome to get a hold of me, it is blackburr@rice.edu and not J Blackburr.
thank you for that correction. My apologies.
That's okay. Just wanted to get it out there.
So is there a way for multiple land trusts to work together to aggregate, given sort of the large scale that may be required? And I know this may be different for every program. I don't know, Jim, if you have an idea for
Sure. I mean, I think, under our system, measurement is the key starting point. We're basically giving credit for the new carbon that is sequestered post-testing. And so it is basically proof of testing that is required. And so from that standpoint, any number of landowners, trust organizations could participate. We have a number that are talking with us about different concepts. At this point, it's just a question of how many buyers will come early in the process. And I think, as we get the buyers lined up, I think there's going to be a large emerging market for all types of landowners.
Great. And Kelly, I'm just going to ask you if you have anything to add as we get close to wrapping up.
The only thing I would add is, the program that the Alliance has put together is looking at aggregating lands for forestry projects. Grasslands, the protocol we're working with doesn't really allow aggregation in that same way, but they do allow a cooperative structure. And so we're really hoping we'll be able to find discrete projects that could join together in a cooperative that could have a little bit of cost efficiencies for the projects across the board, but maybe some great marketing boost around sort of a cooperative of land trust projects. We'll see.
Fantastic. Well, I think we are out of time. I know that was a lot, and I encourage everyone, if you have questions, to reach out to the corrected contact information that I will fix as soon as I can. And after this concludes the morning session for the land for the conference. I know we have a lunch break until 1 o'clock. So everyone sign back in then and enjoy your lunch.